someone afraid of the ocean, he was lying too close to the incoming tide. It had almost reached his feet. But for someone who had acquired faith in himself, he wasn't at all concerned when the water would touch him and he refused to open his eyes, even though he didn't know how to swim. This was the first time that Abner had deliberately come so close to the edge of the ocean without being overwhelmed by the urge to drown himself. So it was no small accomplishment for him to enjoy the experience of waiting for the water to cover part of his body. It was the ultimate test of a startling discovery he only recently had come to. He liked himself. He heard his wife call out to him, warning him of the tide and reminding him not to fall asleep. How far away her voice sounded, but he smiled inwardly at her concern. Of course, he did not want to fall asleep, so satisfying was the heat of the sun, melting the cold out of his body. So pleasant the tingling sensation of the salt spray on his skin. So soothing the noise of the breakers sounding to him, like the laughter of children, rising and falling in breathless sighs and giggles as the water skipped along the beach. It was both rewarding and sufficient to know he could experience pleasure again and appreciate it. For years he had been oblivious to his body's requirements. He had gone without sleep when his body and mind had needed it, had sometimes slept in a chair or even in his car, though his muscles ached for the comfort of a bed, and had made a habit of skipping too many meals and of avoiding exercise and all other interests while living each day under the tension of random luck. But the worst punishment he had inflicted on himself was his failure to have learned how to restore his spirit through the rejuvenation of his body. He had taken all the discomfort and pain with the same desensitized view of himself. His body had been unskilled labor employed to satisfy the incessant demands of his childish will. When, eventually, his body had rebelled and demanded rest, he had either ignored the need or had gone into tantrums of self-inflicted punishment, insisting that his muscles and nerves work on unreimbursed overtime. This was the 7th day of his first vacation in 19 years, and he felt a little proud, privately proud, of finally having done what millions of people did every year without so much as a second thought. He had paid the travel agent in advance for the airfare and hotel accommodations for this vacation with his wife and children. Abner had insisted they take the children out of school, though he knew it would put them behind in their work. He had made a point of making them promise to study on weekends when they returned, but his wife had not objected. She understood the significance of this vacation, so much so that she had cried when they boarded the plane, for it was the first gift he had promised his children, which he had not had to lie about, ignore, or take back. After they had checked into the hotel, the children had changed clothes and gone horseback riding, and Phyllis had called down for room service. She knew he wasn't hungry but had ordered lunch in order to give him something to do. He had spent that first afternoon sitting in their suite, afraid of going out. It had occurred to him with frightening irony that he didn't know how to enjoy himself. He did not know how to play tennis or golf or even swim, and he had become apprehensive of what he might do if he became restless or bored, or too aware of all the distractions, as he had explained euphemistically to his wife. So Abner had read for a while, and then fallen asleep. When Phyllis awakened him in the late afternoon, he had kissed her apologetically. He had to be crazy, he insisted, to pay all that money to fly down here just to sleep. But Phyllis had understood his anxiety and was content to keep him company in their room until dinner. Now he heard his wife call to him again, warning him not to fall asleep, but he had no intention of sleeping. The experience was too stimulating for him to become drowsy. Then something soft bumped his head. He opened his eyes and saw a beach ball resting near his shoulder. It was covered with damp sand through which he could see swirling bands of pale blue, white and brown. It looked familiar to him, like those pictures he had seen of the Earth from the moon, but smelling of sand, plastic, and cotton candy, and he contented himself with squinting at the beach ball through his eyelashes and imagining what it must be like to stand on the moon and see the world so complete and far away. "Hey, mister, grab that ball." It was a boy's voice calling to him. Reaching his arm in back of his head, he cradled the ball in the crook of his elbow and shut his eyes until he heard voices quite close. He looked up at 4 brown knees supporting khaki shorts and higher up, as he squinted against the light, which slipped through the fingers he had raised to shield his eyes from the sun. He saw 2 boys laughing and pointing at him. "You wear beach ball shorts," said the taller one and pointed to his swimming trunks. Light blue with swirling diagonals of brown and white. "We lost 3 volleyballs this week. If we lose this beach ball, we got to pay for it from our allowance." "Where do you play?" He sat up on one elbow to see where they pointed. "Why don't you move farther back up the beach?" he asked, sounding like his wife. "Isn't any fun," the smaller boy explained. "If you can't lose, it's no game," the other one said with sophisticated logic. "Makes it dangerous, eh?" Abner knew the need. He watched them confer, and then the bigger boy pointed to his swimming trunks. "If we lose our beach ball, can we use your trunks?" The 4 knees unhinged to convulsed laughter. "Not with me in them." He tossed the ball to the smaller boy and lay back on the sand, listening to the sound of their laughter dissolve in the gurgle of water and the cries of seabirds. Like a man who cannot yet tell that he has had a little too much to drink, Abner was unaware of the intoxicating effects of the warm sun and cool spray, so that without even being surprised, he fell into the half-world between dreams, memories, and a sensuous awareness of his body, in which the last thing he remembered was the sound of children laughing, and the water tickling his feet like the tongues of puppies. It was his brother's responsibility to keep track of the time. When you're 11 years old and 7 years younger than your brother, you can enjoy the water and let him worry about getting you home in time for dinner. Their father had died when Abner was in the 6th grade, and Danny was a freshman in college. It was the first non-fictional death he had experienced, and the shock to his boyish assumptions about the unlimited adventures of life, which up to then had filled every day with excitement, was kept from morosely affecting his personality only by his brother's willingness to become their father's surrogate. Needing the security and approval of a father, Abner had drawn even closer to his brother, and despite the difference in age, Danny had encouraged him. His brother's friends had called him the Shadow, but because of their affection for Danny had allowed him to accompany them. While he had been pleased just to be accepted by older boys so much stronger, more experienced, and independent, the responsibilities of acting more sophisticated than he was, of pretending to be older, of imitating the behavior of his brother's peers, and of trying to think and understand the world from the limited perspective of the school books he read, had been a strain on his powers of insight, wisdom, and experience. Likewise, his attempts to power his skinny pubescent muscles to hit a baseball as far as Danny, to slide into third base with as much skill, or shoot a basketball with as much grace, to swim or run with the stamina of his brother's friends was more than his body could endure. He never quit, but paid the penalty of physical exhaustion until he grew bigger and stronger. The only games in which he could compete on equal terms with his brother's friends were games of skill. So he practiced with a secret intensity and determination that surprised everyone, including Danny. In rapid succession, he became proficient at billiards, pool, card games, hand magic, balancing acts, and juggling. Money had never been a problem when he was a boy. He didn't need much, and by the time he was 13, he began to win at cards and pool with increasing frequency. He played cards with his friends for quarters and bet them hamburgers and milkshakes against his skills at juggling and balancing. With those who were unaware of his talents, he'd bet as much as they wanted, even $5 or $10. Once he bet he could juggle 4 cans of tomatoes and had lost $25, but Danny had paid the bet without criticizing him or telling their mother. All during these adolescent years, Danny was his idol, his source of advice, guidance, and protection. No boy could be closer to his father than Abner was to his brother. So he was unprepared for the second shock of his life when he discovered that Danny had been drafted. He had learned in pain that he could not volunteer to follow Danny into the army, that Danny would not be coming home on weekends. No, they would not be moving to stay near Danny's camp. That was adult business, and he was still a boy, unable to comprehend the loneliness he was to feel during the next 3.5 years. He envied his brother and all of his brother's friends, listening with aching wonder to their stories when they did come home on leave, wanting to be accepted by them, but having nothing to offer in exchange while they had stories of travel, as far away as California and overseas. Several had come back with wounds and decorations and beer talk of battles, women and careers, all mysteries to him. Then, suddenly, with the shock of genuine disappointment to him, the war was over before it was his turn, and again he felt cheated, for he longed to go into the service just to be able to share with his brother and other teenage males that common initiation rite of manhood. His brother came home an officer, his uniform decorated with symbols of his service, and Abner had assumed that life would continue where it had left off before the war. But his brother returned to college, took a night job at a medical laboratory, and announced that he would become a dentist. That had seemed inconceivable to Abner. Dentists were old men who filled cavities, put braces on children's teeth, and lectured to them about dental hygiene. It was the only time Abner had thought Danny was disloyal. Suddenly the world had become older, cranky and selfish. It wasn't any fun anymore, and there was no one with whom he could confide. His brother's friends were either working or going to college and working part-time, or worse yet, were involved with girls who stole every hour of their leisure time so that few of his brother's old friends came over to the house to play cards or to take him cruising in their cars, or just to sit on the porch and drink beer and tell stories of the war. The world had grown up, become serious, and was no longer an audience for Abner's games and skills, even though he had learned to juggle 6 Spalding softballs, which, by his admission, had been easier to do than to understand Danny's world of work, responsibility, and obligation. Then, with innocent surprise, he learned it was his turn to be drafted, and he knew it would be a good thing, an escape from the experiences of adolescence and growing up that were beginning to strangle him. His mother had not wanted him to go, correctly judging him to be so much less mature than Danny at the same age. He remembered listening to Danny's voice in the kitchen arguing that it was a perfect time for him to be drafted. The war was over, and he couldn't get hurt. It would help him to grow up, see a little of the world, and find out what he wanted to do with his life. He had never loved Danny so much. But he was not drafted, or more precisely, after he was drafted, he did not serve. Heart murmur, a selective service doctor had told him. Unfit for military service. He had felt ashamed of his impaired body, which made him unable to serve his country. This was the 3rd disillusion for which he had tried to compensate. While his brother had studied and worked at night and supported the family, Abner had worked at, quit, or been fired from 100 jobs. And all because of inattention and daydreaming, of wanting to please his brother and his mother, of trying in months to equal the accomplishments for which his brother had taken years. It wasn't a bad thing to want to do, only it was frustrating to be so concerned with the goal of success as to be unable to perform satisfactorily the elementary work necessary to achieve it. And it was self-perpetuating in a most debilitating way. The more he thought about the future, the less he concentrated on his job, which made his work less efficient and therefore less satisfactory to his employers. While his poor job performance led him to spend more emotional effort in planning and in vicariously living through gambling the success he sought and needed. Not so with his brother. Danny had graduated with honors, had gone on to dental school, and eventually specialized in oral surgery. To help him achieve the highest level of his skill as a surgeon, he had designed numerous improvements in dental tools, and when they couldn't be improved, he had invented new instruments and new surgical techniques to complement each other. He had authored books on anesthesia, jaw surgery, and a study comparing canine and human tooth decay. And then, at the age of 36, he had become the youngest professor of dental surgery at the State University. His sleeping self felt a gentle pressure on his arm and that mysterious part of his brain, which possessed self-awareness, even while the rest of him slept. reluctantly insisted that he pull himself back from his dreams and open his eyes. His wife was standing beside him in her beach robe, surrounded by the mauve-red haze of the late afternoon sun. It was time to dress for dinner, she reminded him, and held out a beach towel while he stood up shivering. Now it was different water running down Abner's back, cold needle points from the shower head, unlike the sleep-inducing sensuousness of the ocean spray, hurrying him on in anticipation of a happy evening with his family. He turned off the faucet and stepped from the stall, feeling content, and certainly healthier than ever in the past 20 years. As he dried his legs, he noticed the contrast between the sun-tanned back of his hands and the patches of pinker skin between his fingers. He hadn't seen his hands look like this since he was a kid, spending his summer days on the playgrounds and at the beach. They gathered in the hall and marched to the elevator, handsome wife and children, then walked to their table in the restaurant, conscious of the way the guests looked at them. His were the only teenagers in the dining room, and it made him feel all the more pleased that he had insisted on sharing his experience with his children. Could not everyone tell they were a close and happy family? How right they would be to envy him, but how surprised to know the struggle it had taken each of them to come to this closeness, this open affection for each other. After dinner, they strolled through the lobby, planning to window shop until it was time to go to the movies. But when they came to a display of sporting goods, his wife reminded him that if the children were to take tennis lessons, they needed new shoes. Abner walked them to the doorway, whispered hurriedly that he would meet them at this store or at the newsstand on the far side of the lobby, if they finished shopping before he did. Recalling that they had passed the store where he had left several rolls of film to be developed and printed, he hurried back, hoping the shop had not closed for the evening. He wanted to surprise his family by enlarging and framing the most attractive picture. Though empty of shoppers, the store was not closed, and he was waited on immediately. Abner paid for the package of prints, and before the clerk had returned with his change, he had opened the envelope and began looking at the pictures. To his surprise and satisfaction, all but two had been reproduced in sharp, color-balanced prints. There were so many excellent, even flattering pictures, Abner decided to let the family select the one they thought best. He put the envelope in his pocket, thanked the clerk, and left the store anxious to show the photographs to his wife and children. Outside the store, in the lobby, the sounds of hundreds of visitors talking at the same time lay over the carpeting like ground haze through which he had to push his way. Above the drone of these voices, higher still than the dissonant chords of laughter, calls on the public address system for the assistant manager and the distant ring of a telephone. He heard, or thought he heard, someone call out a familiar name. It wasn't really his name or a diminutive of it, but a special name by which someone he had known years ago had called him. Nevertheless, Abner did not bother to stop walking or look around. He was certain no one knew him here, and besides, the friend who called him by that name had been dead for many years. But again he heard it, suddenly closer this time, just behind the hand he felt on his arm. When he turned, he flinched inwardly at the sight of the man who touched him so familiarly. He looked like someone he knew, or used to know, but the remembrance of that person confused him. For this was an older man with gray hair and several days of beard stubble, which made the skin of his cheeks look dirty, his bloodshot eyes darker, bloodier. Since it was disturbing to stare at the man's face, Abner concentrated on the rest of his appearance. His shirt was stained with perspiration. The faded knot of a food-spotted green tie was pulled askew under his frazzled collar, and his jacket was as rumpled as his uncombed hair. Even his shoes were curled and gray, the way leather dries after it has been immersed in water. "Neddie?" The man stood with legs apart, holding the nub of a cigar in one hand and a checkered cap in the other. He giggled until bubbles of saliva jumped across his lips. "Don't know who I am. Can't guess? Fooled you." He grunted and wiped his lips. "Bad eyes. Always said you had bad eyes. But I knew you. Knew it was you across the lobby." A name formed in his head and took shape in his throat. Though he said nothing, His sense of recognition was inhibited by fear that the reality of this man depended upon whether or not he said the right name. Really got you fooled, hey? The lips pulled back, revealing horse-like yellow incisors, and Abner realized there was only one person he knew, had known, who looked like a horse when he smiled and who called him Neddie. It was Howie Packer, but Abner tried not to have to admit it, nor his curiosity to know how it was that Howie was alive when everyone had told him about his death. But he did not ask. He did not want to become part of Howie's world. Again. Still got you guessing, haven't changed that much. He turned his head to show his profile. It's me, Howie. Then he leaned forward to put his face closer and grinned. Abner nodded slowly as though in a state of shock. He hoped his feigned surprise would justify why he did not reach out enthusiastically to embrace his old friend. His feelings toward Howie were ambivalent. They had known each other for more than 20 years, and there were experiences they had shared together, which even now warmed Abner's memory. Yet he had no desire to resume their old friendship. Too much had happened to him since they had last seen or talked to each other. Having come through more than 5 years of the most rigorous self-examination, personal criticism and confession, as a result of which he was certain all of his pretenses had been burnt away, Abner felt a certain purity, not unlike the arrogance of celibacy worn like a papal seal by some priests. And he could not easily relinquish the secret superiority with which he looked at his old friend. To Abner, there was no greater contrast between what he had been and what he had become than the sight of Howie Packer. He was the symbol of everything from which Abner had escaped and to which he swore he would never return. And now, as if to protect himself from contamination, he stepped back and sealed himself off by folding his arms across his chest. I really surprised you, didn't I? Abner nodded slowly. How's Davy? He smiled briefly, at least he thought he had smiled, still uncertain as to how he should respond to the uninvited and unexpected intrusion of this old friend into his vacation, into his new life. You still married, Neddie? He turned his head and lifted his eyebrows in a gesture of disdain, as though a reply would be more rhetorical than the question. But, in truth, his wife had left him twice since the last time he had seen Howie, and had threatened, promised, and prayed for divorce every day until his saga, as he called it, had begun. And Danny? Huh? He parried, pretending not to have heard the question. Your brother. This was a question for which there was an answer, but Abner chose not to speak it. If he could avoid having to tell Howie that his brother was dead, he could circumvent having to listen again to the same painfully useless questions and the necessity of his repeating the same frustrating explanations. The fact was that his brother had been buried before Abner had learned about his death, and what specific information he possessed about the causes of it, he had learned in a haze of guilt and self-recrimination. Furthermore, it had been too painful and too embarrassing for him to ask questions, the answers to which he should have known and would have known if his life had been less dominated by a private and selfish passion. Abner had not known that his brother had high blood pressure, or heart disease and diabetes. Danny had never spoken about his health, and even if he had done so, Abner knew he probably couldn't have heard his complaints or understood them. So telling Howie what little he knew about Danny's death would result only in questions Abner could not answer, and he refused to trivialize his brother's death for the sake of mere gossip. There was also the matter of Howie's special friendship with Danny. From that day when, by a circumstance he could not avoid, Abner had reluctantly introduced them to each other, convinced that the self-esteeming prejudices of their disparate lives would keep them from comprehending what he knew was exemplary about each of them. He had been amazed by the genuine affection and high regard they had formed for each other. His brother had correctly judged that, despite his appearance, Howie was possessed of innate dignity and courage, for he was totally without self-pity, guile, or selfishness, and Howie had rightly recognized that Danny's accomplishments had required courage, unselfishness, and the same guileless faith in the pursuit of truth. And so, incongruously recognizing in each other those attributes of personality, They were not consciously aware of possessing in themselves, but hoped to find in every man. Danny and Howie had become instant friends. Abner, however, could not afford to reminisce about that past. He was afraid that giving Howie the chance to talk about Danny might evoke in himself such feelings of nostalgia, he would be unable to maintain an impersonal relationship with Howie. Without moving his head, and with his arms still folded across his chest, he could see the face of his wristwatch and noticed the time. "I have an appointment," he said flatly. "Got a woman?" "What? You tied up with some T&A? "I'm meeting my wife," Howie snickered. "Phyllis, you'd never bring her down here. Not only her, but the kids too. Come on, Neddie, have a care. I think you're trying to put a feather in my ear. I know you love your kids, but what could you do for action with them down here?" "Rest." Howie's mouth fell open. "Like the rooster rests when the chickens are running free. I made plans to come down here 6 months ago. Now I know you're trying to diddle me. Nobody makes plans that far ahead. What's your game?" "Tennis." "Heh. You don't play tennis, Neddie. I've taken a lesson twice a day since we got here. Tomorrow the hotel pro's going to start me on golf." "Golf? You?" Howie snickered and wiped his lips on the sleeve of his jacket. "Golf's for people with nothing to do in the afternoon. You must be hitting the casino at night." It had been Phyllis's idea to come back here for their vacation, Abner explained. This was the hotel at which they had honeymooned. You know how some people are about things like that? Howie neighed and stomped his foot. "You telling me you made reservations for this place knowing you weren't going to gamble in the casino? Heh. That's hard cheese to swallow, Neddie." Why did he feel compelled to extricate himself from Howie's honest, if painful insight? He knew he had no obligation to justify his behavior, let alone to apologize for it, to Howie, and yet he heard himself explain that he had been unaware that there was a casino in the hotel. They didn't have one when he was here before, he complained. It was Molly who had noticed it first as they were waiting in line at the reception desk, startling them with her gasp of dismay. Intimidated by the presence of the casino, Abner had tried to find accommodations at other hotels, but at this time of year nothing was available. He had suggested that they go home, and he had meant it, but even to Howie, he could not pretend that he had wanted to go home, after all of the planning, expense, anticipated pleasure, and the significance of this vacation to his family. But he had been prepared to go home, even if he had been frustrated once again by the influence of gambling over his happiness and that of his family. I even called the airline office, but it was impossible to exchange our reservations for any other flight. So, we've had no choice but to stay and to ignore that place. Abner concluded rather apologetically. He pointed toward the casino with his elbow without looking at it, hoping to convey the sincerity of his answer by the intensity with which he stared at Howie. "Phyllis and I know Phyllis," Howie interrupted. "She hates gambling. She wouldn't come down here." "Look at these," Abner interrupted in exasperation and took out the envelope of photographs. "We took these the second day we were here. That's Phyllis." He was almost shouting now. "Recognize her? And that's the front of the hotel. And the boy and girl, that's David and Molly." "Oh, come on, Neddie. Don't do that to me. I know what your kids look like. I used to take them to the movies. They're little." "That was almost 6 years ago," he interrupted. "They've grown up." "No kidding. Makes me feel kind of strange. I want to see them, but I'm sort of..." He touched the lapel of his jacket and tried to straighten his tie. "Maybe tomorrow I'll come by. I've missed them. Can we talk someplace now, Neddie? I mean in private." He waved his cap at the lobby. Abner wanted Howie to stop calling him Neddie. It reminded him of the past and weakened his resolve to keep himself separate from that past. He could not remember when Howie had begun to call him by that name. It was so long ago, nor had he ever been able to understand the reason why Howie did it. Ned was one of the diminutives of Edward, but neither Ned or Neddie had any relationship to his name. Furthermore, to his remembrance, he was the only person Howie had ever addressed by any nickname. Since no one else called him Neddie, Abner heard the sound of that name always exactly and only as Howie pronounced it. He might not even have recognized the name if he'd heard someone else say it. Perhaps this was why the sound of it now evoked such feelings of nostalgia. Suddenly he felt compelled to say something, anything, which acknowledged that past which they had shared, and he repeated the story he had heard of Howie's death. They said the Colombians, or was it in Mexico or Caracas, had shipped your body to Eleanor in Buffalo. His own voice sounded strange to him. God forbid Miss Eleanor should get me. Howie shuddered. She'd put a penny candle in my ear and lay me out in the city dump. It was frustrating, Neddie. They couldn't understand English and I couldn't speak Spanish. I was in the hospital 8 weeks, bus accident. Then I got blood poisoning. In their hospital. Lost my passport and all my clothes. Didn't know until they let me out that they thought I was somebody else. I couldn't leave the country until the embassy could prove I was me. I'm glad to know you recovered, Abner said coldly, even as he observed that Howie did not look well. Neddie, you act like you're, afraid of me. I know I need to clean up, haven't had any sleep in 3 days, but I don't have a disease. Abner nodded gravely, his arms still folded across his chest. It wasn't a comfortable position to maintain for long without moving, and his hands needed to be put down, but he tightened his grip on his arms, glanced again at his watch, and reminded Howie that he had to leave. Let's go to the bar where we can talk. It's my lucky day, Neddie. Abner did not want to go to the bar, it would take too long. Besides, after watching the quiver at the corner of Howie's cheek when he said it was his lucky day, Abner was certain he knew what Howie wanted, and he was determined not to lend him any money. He did not think there was anything inherently wrong in borrowing or lending money. Neither was he afraid to spend or lend his own money. He was in no way parsimonious. To the contrary, his true nature was outgoing, prodigal, generous, even extravagant. He had always enjoyed treating money as a consumable commodity of pleasure. But Abner wanted to avoid repeating his old habits, particularly that of becoming involved again with Howie. He was afraid even of indirectly contributing to Howie's gambling, for he was certain any money he would give him would be used either to pay off an old gambling debt or to make a new one. For old times, Howie prompted and waved his cap in the direction of the bar. I suppose you'll think I'm lying when I tell you I don't drink much anymore. I taught myself not to want to drink unless Phyllis is with me. She's never finished a cocktail, so it's been a good way for me to cut back on my drinking, especially compared to the way I used to do it. Howie made a noise like a horse, snapping his teeth, and winked at him. You mean she won't let you drink by yourself? I'd rather talk to you alone, Neddie, but you can invite her if you want to. I always liked Phyllis. She wouldn't drink now. We just finished dinner. Besides, she's shopping. It wasn't the drinking that was important, Howie explained. He only wanted to talk where it was private. Besides, it would be better if Phyllis didn't see him today. He knew he looked scruffy. He'd had a hard week, particularly the last 3 days. So here comes the pitch, thought Abner, and he wondered what he would say when Howie told him he hadn't eaten for several days, or paid his rent. Or would he admit he wanted the money to pay a gambling debt? Howie, Abner said, speaking his name for the first time, so that the sound of it was strange to him. Let me tell you now, so you can save yourself a lot of effort. I'm not giving you anything. No cash, no checks, no barter, no money orders. He was talking as fast as he could in order to keep Howie from interrupting him. If you're looking to put the arm on me, forget it. Unconsciously, he put his hands in his pockets and twisted his torso so that he presented a narrower silhouette of himself to Howie. No loans. Abner promised himself aloud, looking at Howie obliquely across his shoulder and jamming his fists deeper into his pockets. No third-party checks, no IOUs, and no credit cards. I don't use them anyway. I'm not supporting your dreams, Howie. They always turn into nightmares. Howie's expression changed to bewilderment, and Abner felt a kind of redemptive smugness knowing he had guessed correctly about what he wanted. "You got it all wrong, Neddie." "No, you got it wrong. You're still living the kind of life I gave up and don't want any part of, so don't press me." He felt secure about himself, for this was, to his memory, the first time he had refused to lend Howie money, or to borrow from him, or to bet with him, or for him or against him. "I'm afraid of you, Howie, and that's the truth. You remind me of myself." It was not easy for Abner to admit his fear of succumbing to the temptations of the past, nor of trying to describe the struggle for self-control, which had confused him for so many years. The daily tests of will between his frustrated aspirations for immediate success, wealth and recognition, and the acceptance of himself as a person with limited intellectual, creative, and financial potential. But he was too proud and insecure to explain to Howie his relapses and the suffocating pain of having failed his wife and disappointed his children. That was too private, too personal. "I mean it, Howie. I'm not giving you even $1. Howie closed his eyes and giggled. "You don't need your money." He salivated and smacked his lips. "But you'd like my company's credit cards, eh? Or for me to co-sign a loan? Or is it something you want to sell me?" "I don't want anything except to sleep. If it wasn't for seeing you, I'd have gone home and flopped for the next 10 hours. Haven't had any Z's since Sunday. I've been playing cards for 3 days and..." "Lost again, eh? Don't expect anything from me," Abner interrupted, not wanting to listen to Howie exaggerate his success, boast about how much he'd won, or whine about his losses, the jackpots he'd almost taken in, and his present need for just a little help. It was an old story with which Abner was all too familiar, and in his fear of becoming involved with Howie's faith in numbers, he called him a romantically retarded adolescent without a sense of responsibility even to himself. "You'd bet your house, if you had one, or your wife, if you had one." "What's come over you, Neddie? I never heard you ever talk like that." Howie pulled at his tie and patted his hair. "Besides, it's my lucky day, and yours too." "Then why are you asking me for money?" "Neddie, you don't listen. I won't finance your gambling." "It's just like I said, you don't listen. I just came down from a parlor game where I hit the cage. I racked it up." "Playing cards?" Abner looked at Howie incredulously, disbelieving what he'd heard. "You?" He watched Howie fish amongst his pockets and take out first one, then a second, and third, and now, incredibly, a fourth and finally a fifth packet of $100 and $500 bills, crisp and unwrinkled, bound together with paper wrappers and rubber bands. "See this?" Howie stacked the packets on top of one another and held them out toward him. "This here is more than $86,000. 86,520 strong green men, and they're all mine. I don't need to borrow from you, Neddie. That's what I've been trying to tell you. It's my lucky day." His first thought was that Howie was holding flash rolls. Although he would not touch the money, Abner leaned forward and stared intensely as Howie slowly fanned the packets. It was all there, or at least it seemed to be there. $86,500. "You won this playing cards?" Howie looked up at him and showed his equine teeth. "I did it, Neddie. I beat the house. I won more than 150 jackpots in 3 days and nights. I knew I was going to do it. That's why I wouldn't leave the table to get some sleep. I felt it in my fingers even when I was so tired I couldn't think. Some of the time I played dumb poker, and I still won. You never saw such timing. Nothing could stop me. They even set down a professor and a mechanic, and I steamrolled them both. Neddie, it was like going to church. I drew so many pat hands I had to start losing a few to keep the table going. They thought I was cheating, but I wasn't scared. I knew as long as I sat there I was gonna win." Howie turned the stack of bills upright so that his strong green men stood at attention, ready for parade, silently repudiating the self-assurance with which Abner had assumed Howie needed to borrow from him, and the arrogance with which he had lectured to him about responsibility. "We know each other more than 20 years, Neddie, and you never saw me play cards like that. For the first 2 days and nights I felt like I was somebody else. John Scarney, or Amarillo Slim and Texas Dolly Brunson. My fingers moved sometimes without my telling them what to do. By this morning, I was so sleepy I could barely read the boards. The sweat burned my eyes so that sometimes I couldn't even see across the table. But it didn't make any difference. No matter what kind of game we played, no matter who was dealing, I kept winning. And I wouldn't leave unless the house called a rest. I was afraid I'd break the spell. Nobody's had those kind of cards since they opened the place. You should have seen the way they were looking at me, Neddie. Could you believe it? I iceboxed the game. Me! I was the king of the boards for the biggest pots you ever saw. Zip code numbers. He shook the packs of bills with both hands, raising them over his head. Told me to come back as their guest, you hear? Their guest. They're gonna pay my table antes for a month. What do you think of that? It won't take them that long to get their money back. Oh, Neddie, you sound like a bad sport. I'm invited to play in their tournament. I'm not gonna let you spoil it for me. If you can't stop waving that money in this lobby, somebody will spoil it for you. By this afternoon, they were standing around the table 4 deep. Howie stuffed the packets of bills into the pockets of his jacket. All the palookas and lucky boys had dropped out and I was playing against the house. You would have been proud of me. I knew I couldn't keep going more than another couple of hours. So I remembered my manners and told them I was quitting at 5 p.m., no matter what. If I'd won the last 2 hands, I'd have more than 100,000. But 86 big ones ain't bad, eh? Huh. Besides, if I'd kept playing, I might not have seen you. And now it's all ours, Neddie. What do you mean, ours? I mean, I don't need all this cash. I want you to have some of it. It wasn't enough for Abner to be embarrassed because of his lecture to Howie. Now he felt foolish, even ridiculous. Howie was offering him money. It's our lucky day, buddy. Even if I'd have lost, I'd have come over to see you and Davy. I can hardly wait to see him tomorrow. Besides, I want you to have some of these Philadelphia printers. Or would you rather take McKinley's? Howie took out the packet of bills and offered them to Abner. Remember, Neddie, I owe you. Nonsense, Abner protested weakly, and afraid of being trapped, of not being able to move. He took his hands out of his pockets. His palms felt hot and damp and he rubbed them together briskly, then folded his arms across his chest again. Put that cash back in your jacket. Anybody walking by here can see it. You want to get rolled? He was becoming angry with Howie for the absurdity with which he displayed the money he had won, and for his unreasonable and good-natured generosity. You got to believe in fate, Neddie, when it's a fact. Can't you see it's no coincidence? The very first time I see you in more than 5 or 6 years is the day I leave a card game with 86,520 strong green men. It's a double lucky day for me. How much you want? He whinnied like a little horse which had found its way to the barn. Remember, Neddie, I owe you. Will you put that money away? Abner protested, trying to remain detached from the experience even as he recalled days when the two of them would have celebrated if either had won $1,000. You don't owe me anything, he argued, trying to dissuade Howie from being more loyal to their friendship than it was his own intention of reciprocating. Neddie, we've known each other a long time and we always shared when either of us won. Besides, like I said, I owe you. Nonsense, if you did, I'd remember. But you don't understand. Howie did a little dance of frustration. It's been in my head a long time to repay you. Now that I've got a bundle, you gotta let me do it. You gotta take it. He was overcome by Howie's stubborn insistence on sharing his winnings, and knew he might give in if he did not find a way to defeat his persistence. Desperate to think of a satisfactory argument, he suddenly challenged Howie to tell him how it had happened, that he owed him any money. Go ahead, he prompted, almost accusatively. I want to hear you explain why you owe me any money. Can you tell me what it's for? Now it was Howie who seemed surprised and embarrassed. Abner watched him cram the packets of bills back into his pockets again, light a small peeling cigar with a kitchen match he struck against his shoe, and then put the burned-out match in his breast pocket. It was exactly as Abner remembered him, lighting 1,000 other cigars. It even was the same type of cigar, short, dry and always peeling, so that when Howie lit it, the wrapper began to burn separately with little flares of fire. He even held the cigar in his mouth the same way, between his front teeth the way some people hold a toothpick. Abner could not help but watch with fascination as Howie repeated the same mannerisms and facial grimaces he had seen him make so often, so many years ago. It was like watching a scene from a familiar old movie in which he could remember and anticipate the gestures of a favorite actor. Howie he took a quick puff of his cigar. Then he would he squinted, and then he would wave. He waved, his cap at the smoke. Then his nose. He would scratch his nose and put the cap under his arm. It was exactly as Abner remembered, except that Howie stopped to pat his hair. It had been bothering him for a long time, Howie began, and asked if he remembered how they would bet for each other whenever either of them could not get a bookie. Howie stopped speaking, and Abner realized that he had no intention of continuing until his question was answered, so he responded by acknowledging he had not forgotten the years they had spent gambling, nor all the suffering they had shared. But he hesitated to admit he remembered any particular episode, for fear it might serve Howie with some credible example for whatever he was trying to prove. "Remember the summer you bought that red convertible and parked it in my cousin's garage to keep it clean? What's that car got to do with your money?" He was defensive about that car since it had been paid for by his brother. It was another loan he'd never repaid, which his brother had never mentioned. "It was just before the 4th of July. That fall I went to Caracas. You gave me $4,000 to lay down for you in my name with Charlie eyes." Abner pursed his lips. How could he recall all the bets he's placed with bookies, or those he'd given to Howie to place for him? "When I got to the bookmaker, I took a look at your sheet. You picked 4 Morning Glories. I knew you couldn't win. Those 4 were gonna finish so far out of the money they'd have to pay parking tickets to get past the clubhouse. You never were good at picking horses, Neddie." Howie's voice dropped to a whisper. "So I didn't bet your picks. You never found out because those 4 gave up before the half-mile post." Abner shrugged. "So how much did you win with my money and your picks?" "Nothing. It's the only time in my life I can remember having $100 more than my rent and not laying down a bet." "You didn't bet? What did you do with my money?" I'm ashamed to tell you. I paid a finance company and gave the rest to Miss Eleanor's lawyer. He was going to get a court order to put me in the workhouse for non-support. How could I support her?" He whined and clicked his incisors. "That's why I took off for Caracas." Abner expected to feel anger at Howie's confession, or at least resentment, but his true feelings were of astonishment and guilt, for he remembered that when the desperation to win had suborned the integrity of their friendship, he had cheated Howie, though he could not recollect exactly the circumstance of when or how he had done it. He could not pretend to express anger when it was so far from the truth of his feelings, and he heard himself say that he could not remember when Howie had ever owed him more than he paid back. Besides, that was a long time ago, he chided evasively. Maybe there were days when both of us were chasing our losses, and we held back on each other. Maybe it was hard for him to breathe. "Not you, Neddie, you'd never do that to me. I've always respected you for being straight up with me and everybody, and I tried to be that way. Maybe that's why I've never been able to forget about what I owed you." Abner could not ignore Howie's adulation. It was irritating to him because it was so far from the truth he knew about himself, and yet, in an embarrassing way, it was satisfying to his private sense of accomplishment. He realized that everyone who knew about his past life was aware of the pain he had inflicted upon his family and friends, until he didn't have any friends. The lies he had told his employers and the merchandise and time he had stolen from them, and the lies he had told his family, and the money he had embezzled from them. Even his children knew his past, his failure to have accepted responsibility, the years he had ignored them because of his selfish preoccupation with gambling. And he understood that no one who knew about his past could ever completely ignore it. He couldn't. Perhaps that was why he never gave himself enough credit for having been able to stop gambling. Perhaps that was why he put so much emphasis on remembering those years before the fellowship. Was he purposely being unfair to himself in order to ensure that he would never succumb again to the life he had led? Perhaps flagellating himself with his memories was the reason he needed the succor of Howie's flattering and romantic view of himself. Abner knew it was childlike of him to put such value on Howie's judgment. Howie was the least successful, the least accomplished, and the most naive of all his friends, or former friends. Why did it mean so much to him to maintain an image of integrity with Howie? To his family, and to his intimate friends at the fellowship, he was another member struggling for redemption, trying to create a new person from an old failure. And there would always be doubts. It was the natural scar tissue of every recovering gambler. But to Howie, he had always been the very model of a dependable, honest, successful friend, a loving, responsive father who only played at gambling for the fun of it. So Abner was embarrassed both by Howie's idealistic faith in his character and his own attraction to that myth, and he tried to show indifference by shrugging off Howie's praise. But he could barely move his shoulders. His stomach was churning, and he heard a ringing in his ears as loud as a siren. The secret pain of his conscience kept reminding him that he had not always been honest with Howie, but it was an experience so buried in his memory, he easily could have convinced himself that it was only an empathetic fantasy to Howie's confession. But then how was he to account for feeling, for believing, that he was guilty? How could he explain this private shame? Howie was still talking about repaying him for using the $4,000. Confessing that he had been afraid to tell him what he had done for fear of losing his friendship. That was the only time in my life I was ever scared to tell you the truth, Neddie. Besides, I keep thinking what I would have told you if one of your Clydesdales had won. If, he gasped out the words defensively. That's all hypothetical, and a long time ago. Why don't we just forget it? Now you see what you're doing. You see? You hear what you said? You're trying to keep me from paying you back. That's just like you, Neddie. You didn't even get mad when I told you I'd crimped your 4 Grovers. Why don't you visit Eleanor? Maybe she needs money. I don't owe Miss Eleanor a thing. She cleaned me out before she left. When I got back from Caracas, she was gone, and so was the house, the furniture, the car, and all my clothes. Sold it all. She even took the lint on my socks and my old toothbrush. Didn't leave me a nickel. I know my obligations, and she's not included on my list. But what I owe you is different. You and me have been buddies, and you gotta take some of my bundle. It'll make me feel better. Howie took out the packets of bills again and offered them to Abner. I've got 91 McKinleys and 410 Philadelphia printers. They were gonna give me a dozen Grovers, but I wouldn't take them. Hey. Remember the time we won 10 grand rolling craps in Vegas and took our winnings in Grovers? Drove to San Diego to see my uncle, and nobody's cashed one of them bills. Thought we'd robbed a bank or printed them ourselves. He began to laugh and dribble saliva from the corner of his lips. There's no monkey money in here, Neddie. No wallpaper or gimmies. It's all genuine federal paper. 86,520 strong green men. Why don't you count them? Then you could believe me and you wouldn't feel so bad about letting me pay you back. Abner shook his head and backed away, placing himself behind the corner of the sofa. He wanted to stand behind it, but he didn't want to exaggerate his fear. He only wanted to maintain an independent distance between himself and Howie's money. Never, in all the years he'd played cards, had he won $86,000 on one bet or in one game. He'd never won more than maybe $10,000 or $12,000 at one time, and seldom that much, before losing it all, or most of it, in some other action. And Howie had never won more than $8,000 or $9,000, at least as Abner could remember, without giving most of it back. So the stack of bills which Howie was holding out toward him, all those strong green men, caused Abner to wonder if time and experience had enabled Howie to become a more skillful poker player than he had been in the old days, and if he too would have become even a better player if he had not stopped gam. Abner suddenly and abruptly interrupted this speculation. To make such a conjecture, even a rhetorical one, even if not made in absolute seriousness, was calamitous proof to him of the existence in his unconscious of some lingering fascination with gambling, and it frightened him. Howie moved closer, pawed at the carpet, and held up the package of bills. It doesn't have to be 4,000. You can take more if you need it. Need it? Abner repeated to himself. Of course he needed $4,000. His children were getting ready for college, next year for Davy and a year and a half later for Molly. He needed the unexpected gift of $4,000 as much as any middle-class, middle-aged parent, particularly one who had gambled away so much of his family's savings. Now all he had to do was to hold out his hands, and Howie would count off the bills. It was so easy, so tempting, but Abner knew that to touch that money was to be trapped by Howie's generosity, as surely as if he had bet it all himself. Thus he grasped at the first defense of which he could think, and he began to ridicule Howie for being so selfish and greedy, that he had thought nothing of the suffering he had inflicted on the gamblers from whom he had taken so much money. What are you talking about, Neddie? I won this free and clear. I won it without cheating in an open game. It's got nothing to do with anyone else, not even you. I've been playing cards here for a couple of years waiting for this chance. And now you're proud to walk around with the guts of all those dumb gamblers in your pockets. I suppose you've already forgotten what it was like when you lost? He challenged. Maybe you enjoy feeling like a vampire. For the first time, Howie was not smiling. He shoved the money into his pocket, put the cigar in an ashtray, wiped his lips on the sleeve of his jacket, and shook his head as though to free himself from a toothache. I don't pretend I haven't been a hustler, but this is my own money coming back to me. I probably lost enough the last 5 years to buy my own horse farm. I ain't no vampire. What I won the past 3 days is my money. It's only fair. Howie was not asking him for advice, and Abner knew he had no right to lecture him. Were it not for their old friendship, he would have turned away. In fact, he looked across the lobby to where he had told his wife and children he would meet them. But there were so many people in the hotel, it was impossible for him to see the newsstand. What do you expect me to do? Howie continued. Give it back? I ain't such a silly fool as to do such a silly thing. But you want to give me some of the blood you scraped off that table, just to ease your conscience. I can't understand why you're trying to make me feel bad for winning in a card game, and at the same time you're telling me not to feel guilty for having used your money. You never acted this way when you were losing. All you ever talked about was getting back your money. Money doesn't mean the same thing to me anymore. It isn't a challenge to my self-respect. But you never won 150 jackpots and $86,520 in one game. Maybe that's what's bothering you. I've been playing cards here 3 and 4 times a week for more than 2 years, and most of the time I've lost. So don't get mad at me for winning back some of my own money. Danny wouldn't have called me a vampire, and he'd have let me pay him back. How you won that money or what you claim you owe me has nothing to do with my brother, he corrected, emphasizing the personal pronoun by purposefully referring to Danny in terms of that familial relationship which excluded Howie. It was meant to be an unfair and hurtful answer, which Abner hoped would demoralize Howie from speaking again about Danny. Listen to me, Howie, Abner ordered, and began to back away, talking as he walked, trying to redirect his fear into anger. I won't touch your money. Even if you owe it to me, I won't let you pay me back with what you won playing cards. It's gambling money, and I won't have anything to do with it. He continued to walk backwards. What's come over you, Neddie? I never heard you talk like this. Where you going? To meet my family. We're going to the movies. He looked at Howie and saw the forlorn expression with which he was staring at him, but he had no intention of asking him to come along. In the old days, they were always taking Howie with them, but not tonight. He was too afraid of Howie to invite him now, too afraid of what he might say to his children, or what he might do. Howie was always a gentleman in his own way, but he was a romantic fool, and he might even give his children the $4,000. "Can I come by tomorrow, Neddie, after I clean up? I want to see Davy and Molly." It was difficult for him to say no. He knew his children would be disappointed if they knew he had denied them the opportunity to see their former babysitter and companion. Howie was that rare adult with whom all children instinctively know they may share their most intimate secrets, and David and Molly loved him as though he was their brother. Having observed their tears when they had learned of Howie's death, Abner knew the joy with which they would now greet their old friend, and yet he was certain it would be better if they did not see Howie again. "Maybe tomorrow," he promised vaguely. The difficulty was that they had signed up tomorrow for lessons in the morning in tennis, and for private lessons in the afternoon for golf. His ambivalent feelings about discouraging Howie were evident in the elliptical and awkward syntax with which he tried to explain their schedule. "You wouldn't let me down, Neddie. I know I can count on you tomorrow." Abner tried to walk sideways in order to move faster and still watch Howie. "I don't think this is how old friends should act," Howie whined. "Why are you running away from me?" He was trotting along, trying to keep close enough to talk to him and shove the packet of bills into the pockets of his jacket at the same time. "It isn't important, Howie. I mean the money. That was a long time ago. I forgot about it. It isn't important anymore. It is to me." Now Abner was almost running sideways across the lobby in the direction of the newsstand and the security of his family. But still he kept watching Howie, afraid he would follow him, even as he stumbled into a luggage cart, scraped his knee, and mumbled an apology to a startled bellman. He saw David first, and then Phyllis, and waved for rescue like a drowning swimmer to the captain of a ship. Unable to hide the fear and anxiety which his meeting with Howie had provoked, it was obvious that they had not recognized or probably even seen Howie. And yet why did his wife and daughter greet him with kisses and his son with such a reassuring squeeze of his arm? He gave one last furtive glance back at the lobby, but Howie had disappeared.